Welcome back to the run home, and we finish off with something a little bit different today, Marto. Of course, we all get lonely, and it is Loneliness Awareness Week, starting the 7th of August through to the 13th of August, and you've got a special guest for us.
Yeah, it's the first time Australia has had Loneliness Awareness Week, and I just thought it was very appropriate to bring on an old friend of mine who I met back in 2014 when she was hosting her own radio show on commercial radio here in Perth. Now lives abroad as being the author of 2 books, the most recent one being Let's Talk About Loneliness. Simone Heng, thanks for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, both of you, for having me and making the time.
Now, it's not a topic that a lot of us talk about, let alone read about, but it's something that all of us go through at some stage. Can you give us a little bit of a background into why you felt so compelled to get involved in this type of topic?
Yeah, so I think my whole life I've had issues with feeling that I belonged. I grew up as a Singaporean immigrant kid in Perth, and then also went to live in all these different countries before I turned 30, really looking for my tribe, looking for a sense of belonging. And then in about 2017, 2018, my mum, who's actually based in Perth still, has a very rare degenerative disease, and so she was having issues kind of connecting with me. So it actually started out my work on the topic of human connection. And so then this snowballed into the first book and keynotes and speaking to organizations around the world, from Singapore all the way through to the States, Canada, about human connection. And then that first book that I wrote got picked up by publisher, and they've retitled the book with this title, Let's Talk About Loneliness. But the real meat of the book is actually not just highlighting loneliness as a topic, but giving people tools, as well as sharing my own experiences with loneliness, to kind of break down that stigma around it. It is just a biological response. And if we have time later, I'll go into actually what happens with the body when we are lonely. But it is something that we will all experience, even the most introverted of us, at least once in our lives.
Now, I want to go back to when you and I met, because it was 2014. You've got your own radio station. You're everywhere in the social pages. And from the outside looking in, I would have said that's a very successful, popular person. You're in a relationship. But then I read your book and I realized there was a lot going on below the surface that people would have had no idea about. And that can relate to a lot of us, whether it's us individually or some of our friends, relatives, loved ones. If you don't mind sharing, can you go into a little bit of what was actually going on in your brain that none of us were aware of at that stage of your life?
Yeah, so I'd moved back I was living in Dubai, kind of living the career of my dreams. I was on a big radio station there, and I moved back to Perth, and I didn't really have any of we need 5 different types of connection. You can read more about it in the book, but I didn't have any of the 5 types. And so I felt extremely alone, extremely different, very odd. But I'd always been really adept at connecting with people in kind of a false way. I mean, I think media teaches us how to be likable, how to be charming, but I don't think media really taught me to connect. It taught me to communicate. And those are 2 very different things. So I kind of was, like a veil of myself, if you like a projection of myself versus being really who I was, which was feeling very vulnerable and very, very alone. My family system was kind of breaking down, not just because Mum had become ill, which is a shock to your whole family when somebody becomes paralyzed in your family, right? So everything's kind of crumbling around that. But on top of that, my mother had hoarding disorder, which at the time in 2014 was not yet in the official book of mental health conditions called the DSM-5. So I was cleaning this hoard on my own, which I ended up leaving radio to do, and that was very, very isolating. But I didn't understand what I was seeing. And so I didn't understand that my mum was lonely, led her to do this. Then me quitting my job in radio to clean this for 6 months was leading to my own loneliness. And so I realized that this could happen to me, someone who was outwardly very confident and very good with people. How badly was it affecting people? And that's also where the research started. And of course, then it was exacerbated by the pandemic. But if we look at some of the most successful people, if we look at Marilyn Monroe in the history of the world, for example, one of the loneliest individuals. If you look at right now, I work with a lot of senior leaders at huge multinational corporations based all around the world. Leadership is very lonely. Being a public figure of any kind is very lonely, because that vulnerability which it takes to say, I'm lonely, there's a stigma attached to that. And it is perceived as causing your peers to lose confidence in your leadership. As well as if you're if you have a startup and you're hiring all your mates to be your employees at your startup, you can no longer be vulnerable to them about the things that are worrying you with the business. So you as a leader become very isolated. So actually, what we perceive to be what loneliness looks like is just totally wrong. And that is also why there's so much of my story in the book, because I really want people to know that I've got skin in the game with this, and that, you know, what you perceive as someone being isolated in a nursing home like my mum, for example, is not the only kind of loneliness there is.
What about sports people? Have you come across many of them that have had challenges that you've always got the spotlight on you? And in particular when they retire, of course, there's many that just want to get away and they don't feel like they're connected because so much of their life story revolved around them, the sports person.
Yeah, I think that's a couple of things. I think firstly, it's the narratives we tell about ourselves, right? So if they have fed into the external narrative that's been written about them, you know, and this happens to many public figures, if you are believing your own hype, that you are defined by what is said about you rather than connected. So one of the big types of connection that fights loneliness is self-connection. So having an awareness of your own experience. So my biggest recommendation for sports people, any sort of public figures, is to be able to check in with yourself, do some of that deep breathing, take an ice bath, whatever you need to do to reduce your fight or flight response or any sort of anxiety that you're feeling, and really connect with what's actually going on with you and blocking out all of that noise. Because anytime you have a reputation within a community, there's a part of the human psyche that feels they have to uphold that reputation. That's a huge amount of pressure when you're not feeling good. And the second part of being a sportsman is you're connected to a team. So every day you're going into work essentially and you're training and you're being around other people. And that's giving you, I think, of the 5 types of connection I write about in chapter 2, that's giving you 3 of the 5 types of connection. Now, imagine that all of a sudden you retire and you're in the house and maybe you do some speaking gigs and, you know, you go and talk to people online or you do some media interviews, but the entire nature of your day-to-day has changed. And so we see this with, for example, a lot of American footballers when they leave, you know, there's high the stats on their mental health conditions and the deterioration of their day-to-day lifestyle habits. We've got people who've been in sport from the time they were early teenagers, and now it's taken away from them. So I think it's a whole range of factors there, not just the loneliness, but the big one, if we talk about loneliness, is the removal of that daily connection that they're getting from being with their teammates if they play team sport.
And you mentioned the thing about being a leader, because I always got told if you want to be popular, don't be a leader, sell ice cream, because it can be quite lonely out there when you're dictating from the top or trying to control it from the top. You mentioned a little bit earlier about what happens to the body when you're lonely. Do you mind going through what actually goes through your body?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I want you to imagine, I'm going to go back in time, and all of us are evolving on the savannah as early humans in tribes. So we live in tribes, and the tribe keeps us safe. The body crystallizes the message into the brain, like at the cellular level, that if I'm with other people, I'm safe from a saber-toothed tiger, I'm safe from a storm, I won't get lost. My survival needs are solidified by being in a tribe. Now, what would happen if we were our worst fear cast out of that tribe? We would survive a very short amount of time without the rest of the tribe's people to support with their resources. And so what happens now, even though we live in this crazy AI, very digitally connected world, is our brain still has that same response. So when we are perceiving we're lonely, loneliness is a perception of not getting our connection needs met. So you can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely, right? So if we are feeling lonely, we get a fight or flight response. So we get stress hormones, cortisol, through our veins. And if it's on an incidental level, it's just the body's alarm to say, hey, go out and connect. You need to be around people. You're literally body's like, you're not safe. Your nervous system is saying that. And that's fine. And then hopefully you go out and connect. But if for people who are chronically lonely and feel lonely every single day of the year, those stress hormones continue to go over and over again in their body, and over time it damages their immunity. So this is why when you hear the stats that loneliness is more dangerous for your body than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, having an alcohol use habit, or obesity, it's because of those stress hormones. So what I'm talking about is partly the mental health discussion, but it's also a physical body discussion. So if anyone is a health nut who's listening but is completely not doing their best in terms of their relationships and their social connection, that is going to undo all of the good you're doing with your body, with your diet, your ice baths, your fitness. This has a physiological effect on the actual physical body.
What a brilliant message and an education behind it as well. Look, I know your time is important, but I want to ask you one more question. AI versus connection in a day and age of AI, how important is it still to get out there and have face-to-face, communication and stories and share time with a person opposed to relying on AI?
Yeah, I definitely want to say, if you're a parent listening to this, look, any child or any person with great connection and people skills is going to move up higher up the value chain in an economy where things that are perfect, things that are robotic, things that are AI-driven are going to become prevalent. So any task performed by a human with all of our flaws and our idiosyncrasies will actually become more valuable in the future. And to ward off loneliness, but also just to be somebody that's highly sought after in this economy, you're going to need those human connection skills. So, making sure you're practicing them. I always say to people, it's so easy to fall out of touch these days. So big takeaway, set a monthly calendar reminder, which reminds you to go through your phone, check your most used messaging app for the people that you've not been in contact with for at least 6 months, send them a message, send them a voice note, reach out. Keep yourself part of a social fabric instead of siloed, because with AI, with the way we use technology, it's so easy just to become very isolated.
I love that. I actually went through the book and highlighted just those things that you pointed out in one of the chapters. But the book is amazing. Let's talk about loneliness. Where can we buy it? And for those who want to engage in your services as a keynote speaker, how can we find you and make that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just in Perth over the weekend visiting my mum. So I actually went to Dymocks and Subiaco Bookshop, New Edition Fremantle, and Planet Books in Mount Lawley, and I signed copies of the book. Non-signed copies are at Dymocks and other bookstores all around Perth. I'm going to put up an Insta story at Simone Heng for today. So if you go into my Insta stories there, it's going to give you the full list of all of the places that you can grab the book in the Perth metro area.
Thank you, Simone. You're doing a terrific job. And, of course, Loneliness Week is this week. We do appreciate your time on our show.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a great one.
Simone Heng there, and somebody that you spent some time with. How did you guys meet?
Well, through commercial radio. So that's exactly it. So when I asked from the outside looking in, she was a very successful person, full of confidence, could articulate all of her thoughts. And then you read the book and you realise below the surface, like many of us who have had friends who have, gone through depression or anxiety or are feeling lonely, even though they seem to have a big support network, she was one of them. And I just think I could relate to a lot of what I've read in the book, but just a great person who's very likeable and has now opened up about what was actually going on. And she's a very, very successful person. So to be able to get her on air, I'm over the moon, because it's an important week for all of us. Take note of a few lessons, and if you can't apply it to yourself, see if you can help someone else with it.